Hi everyone, thanks for joining me here on JKD Handmade. For this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to work up this warm and cozy winter cardigan. This cardigan is worked in panels. It is an easy pattern. We have the back panel, two front panels, and then we work the sleeves directly onto the body of this cardigan. For the materials, you will need yarn. I went with this chunky category 5 yarn, which just gave me that warm, cozy winter feel that I was going for. For this tutorial, I worked up a size medium, and for the length of my cardigan, I used approximately 9 skeins. Each skein or ball of yarn is 100 grams. The recommended hook on the yarn label is a 5.5 millimeter hook. Now for this pattern, I would suggest a category 5, which is a chunky weight, or you may even go for a category 4, which is a worsted weight of any brand that's available to you. Apart from the yarn, you will also need 2 hooks. The first being the same as the recommended hook on your yarn label. So the recommended hook was a 5.5 millimeter hook, which I didn't have. So I'm using a 5 millimeter hook, and this hook I'll use for all my ribbings. Then I'll use a hook that's three sizes larger than the recommended hook, and in my case this is an 8 millimeter hook for the rest of the cardigan. So you may go 2 or 3 sizes up on the recommended hook for the rest of the cardigan. It all depends on on how tight your stitches are. So I wanted looser stitches. That's the reason why I went up 3 sizes on that recommended hook. Apart from the hooks, you will also need a pair of scissors, a measuring tape, as we'll be working according to body measurements, a yarn or a wool needle, stitch markers, and yes, that does it for the materials. Let's get on with this tutorial. For those of you who are new to my channel and enjoy my tutorials, please do consider subscribing, and to those of you who already have, a huge thank you. We will begin with row 1, which is a foundation half double crochet. Form a slip knot using the larger of the 2 hooks. Let's work this foundation half double crochet. Chain 2, 1, 2, into the second chain from the hook. So that's 1 and 2. So it's actually the first chain that we had chained. Yarn over, insert your hook into that chain, pull up a loop. You have 3 loops on your hook. Yarn over and go through only 1 loop on your hook. That way you formed a little chain right here, and that chain becomes the start of our next stitch. Then yarn over and go through all 3 loops on the hook. Now you formed the first stitch. Yarn over, insert your hook into that little chain that we had formed earlier on. Pull up a loop. You now have 3 loops on your hook. Yarn over and go through only 1 loop on your hook. That way you formed a little chain right here, and that chain becomes the start of the next stitch. Then yarn over and go through all 3 loops on the hook. We've now formed the second stitch. Continuing on, yarn over, insert your hook into that little chain that we had formed earlier on. Pull up a loop. You have 3 loops on your hook. Yarn over and go through only 1 loop on the hook. That way you formed your little chain, the start of the next stitch right here. Yarn over and go through all 3 loops on your hook. That way we formed the third stitch. Now you'll continue on to work your stitches until you've completed a length of stitches for your foundation row. Now for the stitch pattern itself, I will be using a sample. This is the foundation row and it's a lot less shorter than the actual foundation row of my cardigan. The foundation row determines the length of the cardigan. So you will work as many stitches as need be, depending on how long or short you'd like your cardigan. You will measure that length of foundation stitches from your shoulder going down to your lower body. So you can stop at your waist, upper hip, lower hip, or wherever it may be, depending on how long or short you'd like your cardigan. Once you're satisfied with the length on your foundation row, count the number of stitches and make certain that it's in an odd number. So here I have 11 stitches, which is perfect. It's in an odd number. Remember, your foundation row is a lot longer than mine. This is only a sample, and here I'm showing you the stitch pattern. I will show you my actual foundation row a little later on. Let's get on with the stitch pattern. Row 2. Chain 1. Chain 1 does not count as a stitch, it is just a turning chain. Turn. For row 2, we will be working into the back loops only. So if you look at your stitches, we've got 2 loops that make up a stitch. We have the front loop right here. This is the loop that is closest to you, and the loop that's further away is the back loop. Those are the loops that we'll be working all our stitches into for row 2, row 4, and all those repeats. Take note that the first stitch you work into is the same stitch that chain 1 comes out of. We're alternating between half double crochets and slip stitches. To work a half double crochet, yarn over, insert your hook into the back loop of the first stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, and go through all 3 loops on the hook. Into the next stitch, we'll work a slip stitch. Insert your hook into the back loop of the next stitch, pull up a loop, take that same loop and pull it through the second loop on the hook. As I'm doing here, do try to keep your slip stitches on the loose side, as it does help when working your stitches into these slip stitches in the next round. The next stitch will be a half double crochet, yarn over, insert your hook into the back loop of the next stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, and go through all 3 loops on the hook. The next stitch will be a slip stitch. Insert your hook into the back loop of the next stitch, pull up a loop, take that same loop and pull it through the next loop on the hook. Here you're alternating between half double crochets and slip stitches to complete this round. Make certain that when you get to the end of this row, you are working a half double crochet into the last stitch. That way you started off with a half double crochet and you've ended off with a half double crochet. Your stitch count throughout these panels should always remain the same. Row 3, chain 1, and turn. Chain 1 always counts as a turning chain. Here we alternating between half double crochets and slip stitches. This time we're working it into both the loops from our stitches. So we're going into both loops from those stitches as I'm showing you here. Begin with a half double crochet into that first stitch. It's the same stitch from where chain 1 comes out of. So half double crochet into that first stitch, into the next stitch, slip stitch, continue on by alternating between half double crochets and slip stitches to complete this row. Make certain that when you get to the end of this row, the last stitch that you work is a half double crochet. Your stitch count must always remain the same. Row 4, chain 1 and turn. Row 4 is a repeat of row 2. We're working half double crochets, alternating with slip stitches, and we'll work all our stitches into the back loops only. Into the first stitch from where chain 1 comes out of, work a half double crochet. Remember, you're working it into the back loops only. Into the next stitch, work a slip stitch, work that slip stitch into the back loop only. Continue on with half double crochets and slip stitches into the back loops only. Make certain that the last stitch you work is a half double crochet into the back loop only. Row 5, chain 1 and turn. Row 5 is a repeat of row 3. We're working half double crochets and slip stitches into the entire stitch. So that's both loops from the stitch. Continue on to complete row 5 by alternating between half double crochets and slip stitches. Make certain that the last stitch you work is a half double crochet. Row 6, chain 1 and turn. Here we're working half double crochets into all stitches. We're working these half double crochets into both loops from the stitch. Row 7, chain 1 and turn. Row 7 is a repeat of row 6. We're working half double crochets into all stitches. Again, make certain that your stitch count has remained the same. So this is the stitch pattern for the back panel and the 2 front panels. We've worked 7 rows, but you will repeat row 2 to row 7 to work up the width of your panels. Now this width is the measurement that you will use for the size that you are working on, which I will give later on in the pattern. Remember, we're working according to body measurements for sizes from extra small to 5XL. This is my actual foundation row length. I used 81 stitches for my cardigan, and as I explained earlier on, you may make this cardigan as long or as short as you'd like it to be, just by working as many stitches as need be, measuring from your shoulder going down towards your waist, upper hip, lower hip, and so on. I then went ahead and worked my panels. So I've got 3 of these panels, a back panel and 2 front panels. I started off all my panels with the same number of stitches. That way the length of all these panels are the same. Now when it comes to the width of your panels, you will use the measurements that I provide. It's for sizes from extra small to 5XL. Use the measurement for the size that you are working. Here's my back panel. I started off with a foundation row, which was 81 stitches, and then I worked row 2 to row 7, and I continued to repeat those rows until the width of my back panel measured the shoulder to shoulder measurement plus 2 inches or 5 centimeters. If you look at my back panel, here we have the length of this panel, and on this side we've got the width of the panel. So that's what you're measuring. You're measuring the width of your panels, and it must be the shoulder to shoulder measurement plus 2 inches or 5 centimeters. So here I've got 18 inches. The shoulder to shoulder measurement for a size medium is 16 inches, plus those 2 inches brings it to 18 inches. And if we look at it in centimeters, that would be 41 centimeters plus 5 centimeters will bring it to 46 centimeters. So it's your shoulder to shoulder measurement plus 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Use the measurements that I provided for the size that you are working on. You can then fasten off and cut off on the excess yarn. Now let's look at the front panels that I've worked. I started off with the same number of stitches that I did for my back panel for the foundation row, and then I repeated rows 2 to row 7 until when you look at it here, here's the length of my panel, and this is the width of my panel. Until the width of my panel measures half the shoulder to shoulder measurement for the size that I am working. In my case, the shoulder to shoulder measurement is 16 inches, and half of that is 8 inches. So that's 8 inches or just slightly over 20 centimeters. You will need to work 2 of these panels, 2 identical panels for the front, just as I have done here. Now, look at these panels. Here's this panel on this side, and the stitch pattern looks slightly different. This is actually the right side of the panel. And then on the next panel, I've turned it around and I'm showing you the stitch pattern from the wrong side. I actually like the pattern on the wrong side. So I'm going with the wrong side as my right side just because I like the stitch pattern more. I feel that it's more textured. So you decide which is your right side of your pattern and which is the wrong side of the pattern. We will now assemble these panels to make up the body of the cardigan. We'll begin with the back panel. With your back panel, we need to mark out the neckline along the width of this panel. So along the top edge, we need to mark out a neckline that measures 2 inches or 5 centimeters. Fold your back panel in half as I am doing here. Make certain that all your edges are properly aligned. Mark off 1 inch or 2,5 centimeters from the folded edge. Place stitch markers on both the layers to mark off. When you open up on this panel, you should have a measurement of 2 inches or 5 centimeters from stitch marker to stitch marker. With your back panel right side facing up, place your front panels on top of the back panels, matching or aligning the foundation rows on either side. Place your front panels right side facing down on top of the back panel. So if you look at it, you've got right sides facing in and wrong sides facing out on all your panels. Make certain that you have aligned your foundation rows on your panels. Do the same for the second front panel, aligning the foundation row of that panel to the foundation row of the back panel on the opposite side. Again, it's right sides facing in and wrong sides facing out. We will now seam along the top edges, along the shoulders to join our front panels to our back panel. Make certain that the inner edges of the front panels align with the stitch markers. Using your yarn needle and yarn, seam along the top edges. Make certain that your front panel aligns with the stitch marker. Do the same on the opposite shoulder. I've got both my shoulders seamed. You may remove the stitch markers as you no longer need them. Here are the armhole depth measurements for the different sizes. We will need these measurements to continue on with the pattern. We will now mark off the armhole depth measurement from the shoulder going down along the length of these panels. Measuring from the shoulder edge downwards, also be certain to align the edges well before measuring. Measure from the shoulder downwards. Use the measurement for the size that you are working. In my case, it's a size medium, so that's 7 inches for a size medium. Mark off the armhole depth measurements with stitch markers on both layers. Now count the number of stitches that you've marked off so that you may use the same stitch count to mark off the second armhole depth measurement on the opposite side. That way you know that both your armhole depth measurements have the same stitch count on either side for your sleeves. Now that we have the armhole depth measurement marked off for our sleeves, we can go ahead and seam along the sides of the cardigan. You're going to seam from your stitch markers, marking off the armhole depth to the bottom edge, leaving the armhole spaces unseamed. Do the same on the opposite side, seaming from stitch marker to the bottom edge, leaving the armhole space unseamed. I've gone ahead and seamed along the sides of this cardigan, as you see here, leaving the armhole spaces unseamed. You may go ahead and remove the stitch markers as you no longer need them. To work the sleeve, attach yarn to the underarm. Round 1, chain 2 counts as the first stitch, in this case a half double crochet. For the sleeve, we'll be working half double crochets throughout. Continue on with half double crochets into all stitches to the end of the round. I've worked my way to the end of round 1 of the sleeve. I've worked those half double crochets into all stitches to complete the round into the second chain from chain 2, slip stitch to join. Round 2, chain 2 and turn. Chain 2 counts as our first stitch, in this case a half double crochet. Work half double crochets into all stitches to the end of the round. At the end of the round, slip stitch into the second chain from chain 2 to join. I've continued on with the sleeve, working as many rounds as need be to get to the required length for my sleeve. So all you're doing here is repeating round 2 until you have the length that you want your sleeve at. I ended my sleeve just about 2 inches before the end of my wrist, and that's just to allow for the ribbing at the end of the sleeve. Now, if you look at the sleeve, it doesn't taper off because we haven't worked any decreases. We will taper off on the sleeve by working a tighter ribbing. To do that, you need to drop down to your smaller hook when working the ribbings, and also we'll adjust the number of slip stitches that we work for the ribbing along the sleeve. Continuing on from where we've stopped along the sleeve, using the smaller of the 2 hooks, chain 11. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now this chain is adjustable. You may chain a shorter chain or a much longer chain, all depending on the width of the ribbing that you're looking for. Row 1 of the ribbing, into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. Insert your hook into that second chain, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on your hook. Continue on with single crochets into the remaining chains. I've worked my way to the end of row 1. Count your stitches, make certain that you have 10 stitches. Always make certain that your stitch count does not change throughout the ribbing. We now need to join the edge of the ribbing to the bottom edge of the sleeve, and to do that we need to slip stitch. So I always bring down the ribbing and align it to the stitch, and that's the stitch that I will slip stitch into. Slip stitch into that stitch along the sleeve, slip stitch into the next stitch, turn, row 2, skip those 2 slip stitches, so that's 1 and 2, and work your first stitch into the next stitch. Here we're working single crochets into the back loops only. Throughout the ribbing, we will be working into the back loops only. The back loop is the loop that is away from yourself, and the front loop is the loop that is closer to you. Work single crochets into the back loops only. Continue on to the end of the row. I've continued on with row 2, working those single crochets into the back loops only. Make certain that your stitch count has remained the same at 10 stitches. Row 3, chain 1 and turn. Work single crochets into all stitches. Work those single crochets into the back loops only. Chain 1 counts as a turning chain. Your first stitch will be worked into that same stitch from where chain 1 comes out of. Continue on with single crochets into all stitches into the back loops only. I've completed row 3. Now, if you look at the sleeve, you'll notice that the sleeve edge is rather wide. We need to taper off on this ribbing quite a bit. So to do so, we'll adjust the number of slip stitches that we work in between. Now I've worked 2 slip stitches in the previous row. So in this row, I'm going to work 3 slip stitches. And I find that sometimes I decide to alternate between 2 slip stitches and 3 slip stitches, or even at other times I may just go ahead and work 3 slip stitches all around, depending on how wide this bottom edge of my sleeve is and how much tighter I want that ribbing. You decide based on your wrist and how tight you want that ribbing. You can go ahead and work 2 slip stitches all around, or you can go ahead and alternate between 2 slip stitches and 3 slip stitches, or even just work 3 slip stitches all around. Continuing on, we need to join the edge of the ribbing to the bottom edge of the sleeve, and to do so I'll work 3 slip stitches. So that was 1, and here's the second, and now the third. Then turn. For the next row, always skip your slip stitches. Skip those 3 slip stitches and continue on with single crochets into the back loops only into the remaining stitches. To complete this ribbing, you'll continue on, you'll repeat rows 2 and 3 all the way around the bottom edge of the sleeve. Decide on whether you want to work 2 slip stitches or alternate between 2 or 3 slip stitches, or even just work 3 slip stitches all the way around. It really is up to you and how tight you want that ribbing. I've gone ahead and completed the ribbing. Here it is. Now you can see how the ribbing has tapered off on the sleeve. You know that you complete with your ribbing once you've used up all your stitches along the bottom edge of the sleeve, and both edges of your ribbing are able to meet without any gaps in between, like so. We will now slip stitch these ribbing edges to join. You would have either stopped along the top edge of the ribbing or along the bottom edge of the ribbing. Either way, slip stitching is the same. Continuing on from where we've stopped, chain 1. Insert your hook into the stitch along the ribbing edge as I'm doing here. I choose to work into the back loops on one side and the front loop on the opposite side. And then you can slip stitch to join. Continue on. Insert your hook into the stitch on the one side and then into the stitch on the opposite side. Pull through and join. Continue on with slip stitches to join the remaining stitches. Once you've slip stitched into all your stitches, fasten off and cut off on the excess yarn. Repeat these steps for your second sleeve. I've gone ahead and completed both sleeves. We will now work the ribbings along the front opening of this cardigan. I will not be working buttonholes on this cardigan. Please do go ahead and watch my tutorial on how to work buttonholes on crochet cardigans if you wish to have buttons and buttonholes on your cardigan. Attach yarn to the bottom edge of the cardigan along the front opening. Chain 11. Now this ribbing is exactly the same as the ribbing that we worked on the sleeve. You may decide to go for a much shorter chain or a longer chain. It really is up to you. I've went with the chain of 11, and then into the second chain, single crochet, continue on with single crochets to the end of this row. When you get to the bottom edge, you need to join your ribbing to the edge of the cardigan, so you'll slip stitch twice. Do not slip stitch 3 times, otherwise you risk tightening up on this ribbing. Only slip stitch twice, and then you'll repeat rows 2 and row 3 all the way around this front edge to complete the ribbing. When you get to the ribbing that's worked around the neckline at the top edge of the front opening, along that neckline portion, you will only work 1 slip stitch instead of 2. That way you have a looser ribbing. You're able to work more rows of ribbing there and not tighten up on the neckline even further. So I worked 2 slip stitches throughout. It's just along this portion right here at the neckline that I only worked 1 slip stitch when working the ribbings. I've continued on and I've completed the ribbing along the front opening of my cardigan. We will now work the ribbing along the bottom edge of the cardigan. Before working the ribbing along the bottom edge, we do need to work a row of single crochets along this edge, as there are no stitches to work into. Now you'll see that along the ribbings you do have stitches to work into. It's just along the panels that there's no stitches to work into. Before attaching yarn, make certain that you've got this cardigan wrong side facing up. That way, when you get around to working the ribbing, you will be working the ribbing on the right side of the cardigan. So for this round of single crochets, it's the wrong side facing up. Attach yarn to the outer corner of your bottom edge. Chain 1, single crochet into that same stitch as chain 1. Continue on with single crochets into all stitches. You'll find that there are stitches to work into along the ribbings. It's just that there are no stitches along the panels. You'll work all your stitches into the little gaps along the panels. Make certain that your stitches are evenly spaced and are of the same size throughout. Continue on with single crochets to the end of the row. When you've completed your single crochets, you can turn, chain a chain of 11, just as you had done for your ribbings along the front edge, and continue on working the ribbing as you had done for the ribbing along the front opening. I've completed the ribbing along the bottom edge. We will now go ahead and work those pockets. I've already completed 1 pocket as you see here. I'll go ahead and explain what I did to work this pocket. You do need to decide on the placement of the pocket, and to do so you need to fit on the cardigan and then check on the correct placement of the pocket. The pocket is also worked in panels, just as you had worked the back and front panels, only this time you're using a much shorter foundation row. Now I've went ahead and worked 21 stitches for my foundation row, and those number of stitches fit the length of my hand. So you can decide on the length of your pocket by measuring it up against your hand. 21 stitches was correct for myself. And then I worked round 2 to round 7, and I repeated those rounds until I got to the width of my pocket. Also, the width of the pocket is able to fit the width of my hand. I left behind a long enough tail end to help with the seaming. work 2 of these pocket panels, and once you've decided on the placement of your pockets, you can go ahead and put them in place and stitch all around. Make certain that when you're placing your pockets, you do have them placed correctly. The stitch pattern matches the stitch pattern that you've used for your right side. So it's the right side of the pocket facing up. With your yarn needle, seam around the pocket to join to the cardigan. Leave the top edge of the pocket unseamed. Notice that I'm starting at this bottom corner of the pocket. That's because that's where my tail end was. But as I get around the pocket, I will show you how I went about leaving that top edge of the pocket unseamed. Here I am at the top edge of the pocket, and I've seamed along the 2 edges as you see here. I need to leave this edge opened and unseamed. To get across to the opposite side, I will just go ahead and seam along the pocket itself. Instead of cutting off on my yarn and reattaching, I'm just going to seam along the pocket itself and not join to the cardigan along this edge. When I get to the remaining edge of my pocket, I'll now join the pocket to the cardigan by seaming both together. Do the same to complete the second pocket. Once you're done with that, take all your tail ends to the wrong side and weave in your tail ends into the wrong side by going back and forth into the stitches to lose those tail ends. Weave in all your tail ends to complete. Cut off on the excess yarn, and that does it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoyed it.